Hello and welcome to Hypertrophy Odyssey, chapter 350. It is the first day of the week, aka the Kamehameha workout. I am feeling great, very excited, and looking forward to this workout. But anyways, to the main subject matter for today. Good and Evil Part 3. The 7 virtues versus the 7 deadly sins. So, looking back, I did a whole bunch of videos about these two topics already and looking at each individual thing. And once finishing it up, I was like, I should probably talk about the dynamics between the two and the understanding. Of course, I've touched upon each dynamic, but I think that there is a level of factors that go into each one that I would like to talk about interchangeably between the two, whatever the opposite is, and of each side, and then kind of looking at it from that perspective and looking at it in terms of good or evil, and how, if you go a little too far into the extremes, of course, even in the good side, you can go into an evil, if that makes any sense. Or I wouldn't say you can go into a good on the other side, but still, there is something where you can get further into the darkness, but there is a weird thing where you can get into the light, you become dark. It's very weird, but we'll talk more about that and stuff. But before we get there, I think that this will probably be it for these subjects for a little while, at least from what I can tell, because I think that this will put a nice little bow on it, but it'll also tie into the Good and Evil series, because I do want to talk a little bit more in the terms of good and evil, because we have both on each side and can see where they kind of sort of, I guess, like rank up together. So, and I want to just talk more about the idea of like the horseshoe theory and stuff like that, although that will be its own episode on a different day. But for now, I'll say this: it's very interesting looking at both. I think having gone through all 14 of these sins and virtues, it's very interesting looking at it, specifically how they are just like dynamics based off of each other. But there's a lot of weird internal turmoil with some of these. You have to have certain amounts of sins and then certain amounts of virtues to kind of balance it out. But we'll talk more about that and a whole bunch of other stuff when we get to Mother Base.
All right, so started this day off with dips, which were pretty good. But anyways, to the main subject matter at hand here today. Good and Evil Part 4, because I got it wrong at the beginning and after this. 7 virtues versus 7 deadly sins. So the main reason why I wanted to discuss this is because I think this serves as a little bit of an epilogue to this entire series that I did, looking at both the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues, as this is something that has been on the mind for a little while. And I think that it's important to look at the inner exchange between the two and putting it in the context of good and evil, because obviously there's two sides of it. You can see the sins being the evil side and the virtues being the good side. But there is a weird interchange where we have to kind of look at it in a certain sense where, of course, if you go down the sins route, of course, depending on which one you go down, that gets higher in the scale of what would be evil. And if virtues, there are some that are good, of course. They're all technically good. But the thing that gets interesting with the virtues is that if you go too far into the virtue, it almost gets to the point where you are not a person anymore. And because of the fact that you become unpersoned, it becomes like an evil almost. It's a very interesting dynamic. In essence, when you think about good and evil in terms of looking at it both sides of the coin, where you can get to so good that it turns around and becomes evil. It's like I've talked about before with the yin and yang. It's a very interesting dynamic. So looking at it individually, we have pride on the sin side, which we understand isn't great, but isn't necessarily going to be the end of the world, while humility is great, but too much humility can cause it so that you will be trampled over, so thus you aren't a person. So it's a very interesting thing there where you have to kind of balance yourself out, specifically where you have to have pride in yourself, of course, but not too much pride to where it will lead to your downfall. Coming at this from a religious standpoint, you want to err on the side of humility. It is easier to sway into the sins themselves, and I think that that's what you see with a lot of them. So like greed, the sin of greed versus the virtue of charity. You would want to be as charitable as you can be, the generosity to show others, but it is very easy and temptable to be greedy with what you have. So it's a very interesting thing. But if you aren't charitable with things, that doesn't necessarily mean you aren't greedy with everything, but you can go down that rabbit hole. And looking at it, these two in particular, they're not necessarily that far on the end of evil. Yes, you can go down those rabbit holes, but at a certain point, they aren't necessarily destroying the world or anything like that. Unlike the next one, which is wrath, which on the other side is patience, which understandably so, too much patience means that you don't move, and that is not, inaction is not good, no matter how much you would like to think it would be. Inaction is not a good thing, but also wrath can destroy lives. It is one of the worst things ever. The ninth circle of hell is betrayal, which is basically a wrath upon one person in particular. So looking at it in that dynamic, it's very interesting. I would probably say out of all the sins, wrath is probably the worst, and I've discussed that in my tier list because of how strong it is and truly how wicked it can become, to the point where lives all around you can be ruined. Wrath is at the end of the scale when it comes to evil. You're getting closer to like true unadulterated evil, while patience is good, but it is in the basic levels of good where you aren't doing anything. In essence, you are being patient with others, which is the bare minimum that you would want to do with others. So it's very interesting how they both kind of pull and push between each other. Then next is envy, where envy as the sin is not good, but usually envy is like the starter into becoming something else. Like envy will lead to greed and or other sins in that nature. But envy alone isn't going to destroy lives. Now, it can destroy lives depending on who you envy and how you envy them. But if you look at the other side, kindness is something that would also be very light in the sense of being good, because being kind is the most basic of what would be considered in the good spectrum of things, because we'd want to be kind to everybody in theory. If we were living in a great society, being kind with others would be what we would want to go for. As for lust, lust can also be a very devastating ideal, where if you are on the evil side, lust can destroy you as well as take down others around you, depending on how you see your relationships with the opposite sex. So because of that, when looking at chastity, it's also just a bare minimum type of thing where you don't even have to technically do anything for chastity, for making sure that you don't get down the temptation of lust, really. All of these, although sins you can go down very deep, it's like with the virtues, you kind of just stay surface level with good. You kind of have to kind of go into them a little bit more and practice them, but not only practice them, but also talk about them and really understand them with others and try to show others that these are the way to go, because by combining them, then you become more of a virtuous person, but also a better person in theory. Gluttony can be tough depending on what you're like, and also gluttony is something that I've dealt with through many times of my life, so I understand it completely. So that's where temperance is probably the hardest thing for me to display, because cookies are just that good sometimes. So that's what makes these types of things harder, particularly when it comes to being good with even yourself, because you know that the other side is so delectable, you know? And then finally, sloth and diligence. Sloth is easy to avoid in the sense that as long as you do something, you can get out of it. But sloth can basically put you in a weird circular fashion back to patience, in a certain sense, where you become certain things. So at a certain point, if you aren't doing the right things, you can be circular at a certain point where sloth can lead to patience in a weird way, but patience can lead to sloth. And thus we end basically what is the Ouroboros of the seven virtues and the seven deadly sins, where you go around and come back and it completes the circle, aka the snake eats itself, which is a very interesting dynamic. Both sides can somehow lead to each other. And that is what I believe when I talk about the yin and yang, is that there's a little bit of the other side in each one. So it's a balancing act between the two to make sure that you are in the right mental space, so that way you're controlling yourself, where you are erring on the side of good, but sometimes evil needs to happen. And we will have a discussion one day about the fact that there are people who are evil and choose to be evil. So that's a different discussion for a different day. But for now, I'll leave off with diligence being also a bare minimum type of thing that you need to do for virtues. But the more you do it, the more you can get into a envious state of nature. So it's very interesting. There are direct ones that are opposed of each other. Going down the rabbit hole will lead you to the idea that they will intersect into the other one somehow. It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting things. So this serves as a nice little conclusion to the 7 Deadly Sins and the 7 Virtues series, and I'm very happy about that.
And we're back. Welcome to the workout debriefing. Exercises not filmed, none. Exercises skipped, also none. Got everything in, thankfully. But anyways, to the main subject matter for today. Good and Evil Part 3. The 7 Virtues and the 7 Sins. So the main reason why I wanted to discuss this is because I just finished editing the final episode of the tier lists for the 7 virtues, and then when doing that I realized I should probably just talk about the interexchange between the two, because I mentioned it in the virtues, but I don't feel like I went in depth enough on the ways that people can go very deep into one or the other. I think that if you go too far into the 7 sins, like if you go into each of them and pursue them fully, you'll get to a point where you are living in a world of isolation, where you are literally just a whole lot of evil incarnate, but you are yourself. Nobody really wants to be around you, regardless of which one you are dealing with, because they're all in a weird way self-isolating from the world. And the opposite, where if you go to the virtues, if you do the virtuous things to the fullest extent, you can lose yourself in the crowd. Basically, you are absolving the self, really, which isn't necessarily good either, which is a very interesting dynamic between the two, because it's like, one, you're going into self-isolation, yes, which is not good in the total term. You can be fine in a certain sense, but in this sense, you're isolating yourself for reasons of some type of self-pleasure and or lack of self-control. But in the other side of it, you are absolving yourself to the point where you become non-personed. You become part of the group. You become almost a specter of a person, which is a very interesting dynamic, where you are just too much of something, which, I mean, certain things it can be all right, but sometimes you can't be too much of that, or else you're going to lose your self. So it's an interesting dynamic where you have to pertain a little bit of yourself in your world. So there has to be some type of sin in your life, but you cannot overdo it, or else you will only isolate yourself outside of the world itself and become evil incarnate. Or the other way around, where if you do virtuous things, then the world will want to be around you, but at a certain point, if you just continue on that pathway, you might become a selfless person, and thus you have absolved yourself from yourself, and thus become a entity of just thing. You aren't a person anymore. You are just a being. But even though we would like to believe we would want to do something like that, I don't think that's necessarily accurate, because then you're not a person anymore. You're more of an idea. And when dealing with people, I think most of the majority of people would want to deal with a person and not an idea, because most of the time when you talk to someone, you talk to the idea of them in a certain way, but most of the time when you're actually talking to them, you're talking to the person. So it's all of the things rolled up into one to exude into a human being, rather than being the idea of somebody. And that's what happens a lot in relationships, where you're talking to somebody, but they're talking to somebody in their relationship, but that person isn't necessarily the person. It's the person that they have playing in their mind, not the person that's actually in front of them. And that makes things obviously complicated, especially in relationships. And that's why when looking at them in both dynamics, it's weird, because you don't want to necessarily go too far in either extreme, because you don't want to be isolated from the world and you don't want to become a gelatinous blob. So it's a very interesting dynamic, because you want to just kind of balance it out. Of course, it always comes back to balance and yin and yang and all that other stuff, but it's just interesting to think about even in more Catholic terms than something like yin and yang. But at the end of the day, they understood a balance in between as well, that you can't really necessarily go forth into it. Now, obviously, people will lean towards one or the other, and if you are just straight down the middle, that's also an issue, because you become a non-playable character, or just an NPC where you are just living through life. It's not necessarily you are choosing your battles or anything like that, and that also can become an issue, but that's a little bit different. I think that's a different story for a different day. But for now, it's just an interesting thought exercise I thought I had, because it was very interesting to see both sides of the coin when it came to that. But anyways, with that being said, though, tell me what you think in the comment section down below. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions about this one. This was I wouldn't say this closes the chapter on the 7 virtues and the 7 deadly sins, because I'll probably come back to them eventually. But it is a little bit of an epilogue almost on the series, and the ideas between the two ideas coming together, really, and combining, and kind of like getting an idea of what would be either side of good and evil, because it's always interesting to look at these types of things, because a lot of people don't want to talk about this for some reason or another. But anyways, with that being said, thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please share this video with anybody who may or may not like it. I will be back on tomorrow with a new video. Thank you very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I will see you in the next one. Keep it heavy. Stay safe out there. Stay cool out there. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace!